Well, welcome everyone. February Future Work Scotland. Back again for another great session for you all. It's great to have you here. I'm your host, Sathpal Singh, everybody calls me Sath. I'm joined by my co-host, co-organiser, Donald Henderson. Welcome back. Just the usual formalities. A few of you have been here before. Familiar faces, very simple code of conduct. We simply ask that you're all respectful to one another. We want everybody to have a great experience. So that's all we ask. Very simple, very straightforward. We will do a few updates on what we've got coming up at the end, as we typically do. We also give you the opportunity to share anything you might. So if there's a different event you're going to, or a conference that's upcoming that you know of, and there's maybe still spots and places, and you'd love to just share it in the group, you can drop it in the chat. You're happy for people to come off and mute and share at the end, just as we bring the session to a close. So just to remind everyone, that's always an option in these sessions with us at Future Work Scotland. If you do have questions along the way, I'm going to hand over to our speaker in a sec. Please just drop them in the chat. If you can prefix them with a Q, that helps us to find them and sift through all the other chat that normally goes on in the chat. So just put a Q there so that we can spot that it's a question. That's always helpful to us. So we thank you for doing that. And with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Stephen Morris to Future Work Scotland. It was a great chatting to Stephen early in the year to get this session sorted out. If you don't know Stephen, he is a speaker, he is an award-winning leader, and he is, of course, an author. That's what brings us here today, because we are going to hear some of his perspectives on leadership and organizational design and development from his awesomely titled book, Leaders, Believers, and Expert Deceivers. I really like that, so I'm really excited to hear what Steve is going to share. Donald just held up a copy there for you all. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Stephen. Stephen, welcome, Future Work Scotland. The floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Sath. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Donald, for holding up the book. It's kind of you to do that. Sath gave a lovely introduction anyway. I certainly don't want to say anything else. I was just going to briefly describe what I'm going to talk about, or intend to talk about in this session, which is, broadly speaking, a summary, I guess, or some of the highlights, some of the key points that appear in my book. Some of it perhaps a bit further, because I finished writing that several months ago, so things have moved on, just as they ever do. We're a fairly small group. I know we're going to have questions moderated in the chat along the way that Sath and Donald will look after. I'm very happy to take questions along the way through that, because one thing I will say is there's quite a lot of stuff here, so you might want to ask a question while we're there, or indeed you can, of course, because we're recording it, go back and go that way. So let me share my screen and I'll set that up a little bit in a bit more formality for you. Right. So the question that sits behind the work that I've done in the book, and actually more broadly than that, a question which I've had for a great deal of my career, has just been quite simply this. Is there an optimal way, or is there a right way to lead teams and to organize ourselves to deliver stuff? I've spent quite a bit of time in program project management functions, looking after software teams through to all sorts of different marketing and you name it kind of projects. And there was always this sort of question in my mind. Over the last 4, now slightly more years, I tried to kind of answer that question in a bit of detail. So lots of research, reading arguments with people and otherwise to try and come up with something. And then in this conversation now, the intention is to effectively just bring you a little bit of that. If you imagine, my little ant there is going to there's danger of this being slightly cheesy, so I really didn't mean it to be cheesy, but you see the ant occasionally, and I may regret that decision, but we'll see what happens. You can tell me later. So to put a bit of color into what I am actually talking about, I'm going to see, I told you, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Don't worry, that's the last one of anything like that. There are 4 kind of main themes in this talk. A bit about leadership, a bit about delivery, There's a reason for the little squiggle in the middle. I'll come to that later. Then talk a bit about contexts and making sense. And hopefully all of that will make more sense as you go, but a little bit of a navigation, if you will. So beginning with optimal leadership and starting with that, I started my leadership career probably in about 2000, something around there. And like many, I had kind of this view of leadership. That a leader is this great person that stands at the front of everything, cape flapping in the wind, if you will, and this sort of heroic Hollywood style of leadership. And I guess being very open to that and very naive, maybe you would accuse me of being, there had to be some sort of reason why an average employee salary was something like this, represented by this little green square, where the average salary of a UK CEO equated to about 84 times that. And for an American CEO, somewhere around 353 times that on average. So clearly these leaders are doing something right. They must know something and so on to reach the office and reach the kind of state that they reach. Then, of course, the experience you get in leadership is actually ends up being quite often quite administrative, lots of bureaucracy. For many of us, it isn't quite perhaps what we expect it to be. Maybe you could say a few of the things on this list are leadership, and we could have that argument separately. But the point is, most of it, well, frankly, I spent most of my leadership career in a spreadsheet. I think that's probably the best way to describe it, of one type or another. But despite that, or along with that, maybe, there are endless vendors, consultants, and so on that will tell you that in order to be a successful leader, in order to be a successful anything, to run your team effectively or whatever, you should do one of these things, which, by the way, of course, they will offer to sell to you and probably offer to train your teams as well in this stuff. And I suppose that makes a sense a little bit again, because it leads us to a point where there are hundreds of different leadership styles that sort of come out on the backside of that, where different people are promoting different things. We're maybe very familiar with things like servant leadership, which I'll touch on a bit later, and authentic leadership. But there are many, many others that exist out there. And my current list is now, I've got to 180 in my current list. So this is slightly out of date, but to be fair, anything more than 50 is kind of illustrates the point pretty well. The thing is that starts to set up a bit of a question in your mind, or it did for me. If there are all these things out there, how is it that someone can say that there's a right way of doing anything? And then perhaps more evidentially than that, going back to the point I made about CEOs, in the studies that I've read about the effect that CEOs actually have on organizational performance, you typically see numbers like this. So this particular one, which was a paper by a researcher called Mark Fitzer in 2014, described the effect of a CEO that can be distinguished from pure chance as only being somewhere between 4 and 5%. And you might think, well, okay, a $1 billion company, 4% is still quite a lot of money, and it's still quite a lot of impact. But compared to the company effect here, which is effectively everyone else in the organization, that's a fairly small number. So that led me to the journey, and basically where I'm hoping to take you today, this morning, apologies, depending on where you are. So I began my career, like many of us, with this, there must be a right way, which turned into people telling me that there was, me realizing that there probably wasn't. And then the more research I've done has got me into this sort of slightly more concerning, oh my, kind of space about the industry at large. So sticking with leadership, where I began thinking about this more formally, I thought, well, a reasonable place to start might be to look backwards. And I've looked at many, many different leaders, and I'll talk briefly about one here this evening. So I'll pick on the guy in the middle here, which is Alexander the Great. And many people across the globe will certainly know this man's name and will be aware perhaps of the achievements that he had during his relatively short life, he was a hugely accomplished military general, developed this, for the time, actually one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, the Hellenistic Empire that he supported, actually lost no military campaign in his entire life, and was known for some of his philosophical views and otherwise. We also know that Alexander, despite those successes, also had something of a messiah complex, or a god complex, rather. He believed very sincerely that he was the son of Zeus Ammon. And at one point in a visit to Egypt, he met an oracle. And before anything had happened, before he'd even opened his mouth, the oracle greeted him as being the son of Zeus Ammon. There was a story even going around that his mother had been struck by lightning while she was pregnant with him. And the suggestion was, of course, that that came from somewhere else, as it were. So we have that. He also had quite a serious problem with alcohol, and actually got to the point in one particular episode where, drunk with his sort of closest soldiers and otherwise, got into an argument, picked up a spear and put it through one of his more decorated captains, actually someone that had saved his life a little while before. Not to spoil the punchline too much, but with all of these people, and I'm certainly not going to go through them all, but with all of these people that I've got on this, and indeed almost anybody you can possibly name, there is always more than one perspective to a leader. So to say that this particular person is a great leader, maybe they are. Maybe in that particular situation, yes, we could say that they are, but they're all going to have something of another story behind them. So that doesn't particularly help in answering the question of whether or not there's a right way to lead, perhaps. So bringing this up to date, or bringing this further forward, I'll talk briefly about this guy. So Thomas Carlyle was an essayist, historian and philosopher in Scotland. And he, I suppose, built on the view, that historical view of this leader being this great person. And his suggestion to, whether it be to countries, to leaders and so on, was that this idea that we should be able to find the best person, which clearly at the time is going to be a man. There's no perhaps surprise to him arguing for that. And then once you found that person, if you elevate that person to the right role and give them all of the space, they are going to be the perfect person to lead your country. He goes on in this quote to talk about no ballot box, parliamentary eloquence, voting, constitution building, or other machinery of government can improve it a whit. So all you've got to do is find the right guy, put him in charge, and you're sorted. We kind of know that that's not true either. So putting a little bit of more science in this and slowly bringing us up to date, from Carlyle's work, as we enter the beginning of the 20th century, there were two main schools of thought that people talked about in terms of leadership: trait and behavioral. Trait is what it says on the tin, i.e. the traits that I have I got a particular skill that I'm able to deploy? And behavior is about a leader's relationship with other people, for example, the followers, the people in their team. An example of trait-based leadership, and I'm slowly bringing us up a bit more to date, is Charles Bird, another psychologist. In an exercise in his book in 1940, he did an exercise of asking organizations, what is it that makes, what's most important for you in a leader? What's a great leader for you? And this is a short list of the responses that he received. To summarize that a bit for you, or highlight a few things actually, of the respondents to this, 50% of the companies that he spoke to said that high intelligence was important. 30% said that initiative was important. But curiously, 65% of the traits only appear once. So what does that begin to tell us already about these organizations? I can't see my chat, actually. I've just asked you a question and I can't see my chat. Nope. Maybe if I click on it, there we go. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Sorry, excuse the technical issues. It was kind of you. Sath, you were talking about you having technical problems and it plagued me first. So all good, all good. Exactly, there's no consensus. And we know that this makes a whole world of sense. Okay. And a simple example, if I just give you this spectrum here, on the left-hand side, a fire, and on the right-hand side, let's say the delivery of a new product or something like that. We know that in the event of a fire, an autocratic style of leadership is likely to be what we need. We want people to just do what they're told and get out of the building. We're unlikely to, in the event of a fire, when the alarm goes off, get everybody round a table and do a little ice-breaking exercise where we find out what your favorite animal is and that sort of thing before we decide on what to do. Of course not, be mad. And likewise, at the other end, if we had a new marketing campaign or we're trying to launch a new product into a new market space that we've never been to before, we want to collaborate more. It makes a kind of great deal of sense. And an example that I use quite often to illustrate this actually comes from the 1980s in the UK. Some people within the Home Office, within the government, were role playing and thinking about scenario planning of what would happen in the event of a nuclear attack on the UK. So, how would we respond? What would we do? One very serious suggestion from one of the team in the Home Office was to identify and employ the psychopaths that we knew about in society. The basic feeling being that in such an emergency, we would need people that can make very quick decisions and not worry too much about the moral code of them, and therefore they'd be able to do things much faster. Take if you think about the trolley problem, for example, which I would imagine many of you have met, this idea of a runaway train car or trolley is going down a track and is going to hit a group of people. You happen to be stood by a lever and you're able to move or divert the tram, but it will hit one person instead. So you've got that balance of, do we get the group of people or the single person? It's a moral reasoning question and something in, say, driverless cars that we're going to have to handle. Jane's point here in this particular case was a psychopath isn't going to have that problem. They're going to do the thing that mathematically works out the right way. That's the idea. Excuse the slightly extreme example. But this gets us to kind of where we are now, where you've got this third school of thought that lands in here that says context is important. And we kind of today are sitting around a combination of the two. Context and trait tend to link together a bit. Kind of. I say that simply because, coming back to this list, you could look at this and say, well, this is wonderful because given the myriad of contexts and the differences we're going to have in the situations, brilliant. We've got an army of choices here. But if you go onto LinkedIn, for example, it's very difficult to find more than 2 or 3 of them because that's the right way to lead, for example, that people will say. So a bit further down that particular rabbit hole, I just want to talk briefly about servant leadership. So servant leadership is one of those, probably next to authentic leadership, which is an entertaining conversation in itself. But servant leadership is extremely popular, and there are some statistics there about just how many resources there are out there. There's an important question I think we should ask, though, which is whether or not it works, especially if we're talking about how important it is that everybody does it. So if I pick up on this particular flavor of servant leadership, because I didn't say it earlier, but in many of these cases, authentic being a good example too, there isn't just one definition of this stuff. There are many different opinions about what it is. This particular one that I'm using here is based on work by, or a book rather, by James Sipe and Don Frick, and they highlight 7 traits of this particular leader. So to be a good servant leader, you should do these. You should do these 7 things. Back to the trait stuff I talked about earlier. Some of it maybe makes sense, putting people first. That feels very normal. things about person of character and leads with moral authority. Maybe that's where I start to lose a little bit of the thread on what they're getting at. But this is just a definition. So to answer the question of whether or not it works, quite an interesting perspective on this, and I haven't linked the paper in here, but the paper's linked, all of my research obviously is linked in the book. But I'm glad to follow up afterwards and share what it is. A team looked at servant leadership from the perspective of trust, and specifically the perspectives of trust, rather, between cognitive and effective trust. So we're probably all quite familiar with the idea that there's different kinds of trust that we might have. Just to break this out and its relevance to teamwork, however, if you imagine a leader and a team, a leader that can develop cognitive trust, that comes from a leader's ability. So if you think of classic artisan kind of management, someone who, the software engineering manager that can write software, for example, the marketing director who absolutely knows what they're talking about, and that creates cognitive trust, and that in turn drives task performance. Effective trust, however, which is a different thing, is generated by a leader's concern and care, their kind of their warmth and encouragement to their team. That, by contrast, creates individual performance. So that's an individual's motivation and the amount of activity that they do, and this thing called OCB, organizational citizenship behavior. Basically, are you a nice person around the office? Do you help and support and so on? So, quick question, where do you think servant leadership fits in between those two types of trust? What do you think it might support? Cognitive or effective, or both, or towards effective? There we go. Absolutely, you're right. It does pretty much nothing for cognitive trust. And you say, well, okay, that's maybe okay. We want individual performance and so on. But there's a concern certainly about task performance, i.e. the quality of what gets done. But there's a bit of good news, and bit of bad news first, and then there's a bit of good news. Sorry, wrong way around. Bit of bad news first is that trust between a team and a leader seems to develop in this order, i.e. you need to develop cognitive trust before you develop effective trust. So the very black and white, and this is the rather unnecessarily naive way of looking at it, you could say, if you only had servant leaders, we're only going to get effective trust. We're not going to do anything about the quality of what actually gets delivered. The good news, though, is that other leaders in the organization may be able to provide that cognitive trust, therefore giving you both sides of it, good quality tasks delivered by people that are well engaged and good citizens in the organization. So whether or not you agree or not about this particular paper and the way that it's described, it's a useful reminder perhaps that just because a form of leadership is being described as being you really should do this thing, very few, and I'll come back to that later, of these have ever been properly studied to find out whether or not they're effective. And again, we talked a bit about context earlier, and we'll come back to that later. It might work, but really in your situation, you may not know. So I'm going to step us on, and we'll come back to this stuff in a minute, but I'm going to step us on to talking a bit about delivery and getting things done. Just a quick check-in with the room. Are you kind of okay so far? Pace okay? Comfortable? I've got some thumbs. That's all good. That's all good. That sounds very indulgent, me asking that. I didn't mean it that way. It was more to make sure I'm being helpful, because I need the reassurance. I don't really quite like that.
Just while you pause, Stephen, Patrick's got his hand up. I don't know whether you were hoping to come in. But Patrick.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Seth. And Stephen, this is really interesting. I really appreciate the thought you put into this. I love the history and the approach you're taking to present this. You just said something that struck my curiosity. If you could you explain how studies are able to isolate the factor of leadership and say that is the factor that had the impact, like demonstrate a causal relationship between that? Does that question make sense?
It does. Can I ask you to hold that thought?
I will hold that thought.
I'm going to come
I'll
back
hang
round.
out.
I am going to come back round to that, and yeah, you probably in a sense see a little bit about where this is going, but
no worries.
I will
Thanks.
explain that in a bit more detail soon.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, I'll carry on a little bit then. So delivery. So I know I just brought us up to nearly the 21st century, but I'm going to take us back again. Want to talk about delivery. So if we think about delivery, and I do this a few times in the book anyway, I kind of go to first principles really. Right, get to the next slide. So when we're thinking about delivering something, there's a very basic equation flow, if you like, going on. We've got some inputs, some actions, and some kind of an output. So here there's some ingredients, for example, to make a loaf of bread. And the way that I was always taught, and very explicitly taught at one point, was if you have quality at your input and you have a quality process, you will always get a quality output. And I suppose in a loaf of bread, that kind of makes sense in as much as good quality ingredients plus a reliable trained process will get you a consistent loaf, perhaps out of the other end. It kind of makes some sense. And maybe if we want to be more in control of that, we can take that much further back. So we could go control the quality at the farms, control the quality of every single step, as it were, in the process to get that loaf of bread to provide the quality. And I guess some Michelin star restaurants do exactly this kind of thing to control the quality of stuff going into what gets produced the other side. That's kind of fine, but that has less application when we start doing things like building a cathedral or launching a major organizational restructure or whatever that thing might be. Historically, the way that we've handled this sort of thing is through this, and I'll zoom in on a few here. The introduction of guilds to do things. So if you think about that cathedral for a second, if I was just trying to build that and we were back in medieval Europe somewhere, I've got to find, 1,000 stonemasons and all of these other roles and people, and we've got to find people to feed them and so on. How do I know that I'm getting good quality people? And for the artisans, how do they know they're getting a good deal and are going to get well paid for what they've done? This is where the guilds, and in here, say the baker, the third one there, this is where the guilds stepped in. They provided a little bit of some structure, some scaffolding, if you like, around the work that people were doing. So we could guarantee the quality of a stonemason, and the stonemason would guarantee, or much more likely anyway, that they would get paid appropriately for what they did. What that did, and somewhat politically, or rather of the time, if I give you this example, so slap bang sort of in the middle of that period, this is one particular description of this sort of setup from Becker, who ran a number of laboratories and so on in Germany. He defined this structure of an organization, or in his case of the laboratories, of the workshops, to say at the top we've got this consularius laboratorii, effectively the person who knows what to do, and they write the instructions. Then you've got the dispensator in the center who just tells everyone what to do. They have no opinion of themselves. And then finally, the laborers just do what they are told at the bottom. Thinking to sort of medieval Europe, this had the advantage of the sort of quality stuff I talked about earlier, perhaps more, quite the word is, more politically at least, it enabled a kind of reinforcement of the social order. So it made sure that the lowest social ranks were kept at the bottom of the tree and those who knew what they were doing at the top. So that's in the 1700s, sorry, in the 1600s, but those sort of ideas have pervaded. We continue to talk about them. And I just talk about two people briefly here. We've got Winslow Taylor, and Taylor, or Taylorism, is something that's quite commonly talked about, I've found. He's one of the pioneers of scientific management. Basically, the idea that if you study in detail the processes that people do, you can control them. Back to the Q plus Q equals Q thing earlier. The quote on top about the shovels relates to one particular part of his book where, looking at laborers moving materials, he and the analysis and the team that he got to look at the situation discovered that different laborers were using different shovels and concluded that that affected productivity. The basic idea being, if you've got a really big shovel and you're moving stuff that's too heavy, you're going to be slow. But if you've got a small shovel and light material, you're also going to be slow. Hence this idea that a fully loaded shovel should be 21 pounds to be most efficient. That's why a snow shovel is this big, and that's why a coal shovel is this big, and it still continues to be the same today. That continued a bit further. So you've got Sloan here, who was the chairman of General Motors. There was a fascinating interview with him talking on I can't remember the name, who interviewed him, but it's on YouTube. If you just look up Sloan, you'll find him easily, talking about how he ran his organization. And basically it comes down to everything in a vehicle can be broken down to its constituent parts and controlled, and everything in the people can be broken down to their constituent parts and controlled. And that was kind of his idea of organizations and so on. You control. We know, and especially in a group like this, I'm sure these are conversations you've had already, that doesn't always work. And as you start to introduce more components, certainly more complex components, things get challenging, and you end up in some really interesting and fun situations. And I have a favorite example that I can't not share, is just this, which is just a picture of a group of St. Maurice men, so traditional folk dancers in the UK, who this group were employed by, or intended to be employed by, a local council. So if you imagine, this was back in the 1980s, there's a nice sort of summer fair, you know, people coming out to enjoy the sunshine, or probably it is the UK, you never know, but they're going to come out to enjoy the day and so on, and they're going to have some dances. They didn't, unfortunately, ever get to dance, because that was just after the then Conservative government had told every government department that their suppliers must be ISO compliant. So unfortunately, because the dancers weren't ISO compliant, they got cancelled and they did something else instead. It starts to feel like this is a little bit crazy. Meanwhile, and while this sort of stuff is going on, there are other voices and other people are saying slightly different things. Deming, are people quite familiar with Deming already? You've lots of nods in the room. Yeah. So Deming, of course, then Deming's view was much more of a systemic view to things. It wasn't about making sure that every single individual, he was more concerned about the breadth of what was going on. And just to highlight three of the things that are in his Out of the Crisis book, 3 of the 14 points are these: ceasing a dependence on inspection. So we want quality in the process rather than checking that we've got quality at the end of the process. We want coaching rather than judging in our leaders, and this idea of driving out fear. Psychological safety, anybody? This is clearly an example of psychological safety from the 1980s when he wrote the book, but a lot further back. Where this kind of got me to is, because I think both of these views of the world still exist in different organizations, is that there are broadly 2 philosophies that exist when you think about getting stuff done in an organization. And I've characterized that on the left as this sort of management of outputs idea, this Taylorist controlling kind of way of working, or a more enabling view, a la sort of Deming, on the other side. To color that in a little bit, I put things like ISO very much on the left-hand side here. It's quite easy to demonstrate the productivity losses by implementing things like ISO, being so expressly intent on understanding inputs and outputs everywhere. I've got things like management by objectives, Peter Drucker's famous stuff in there, as well as the larger scaling frameworks from things like SAFe, Agile, that are very much about that same structural control. In the enablement, we've got some agility, for example, some DevOps and so on. But broadly, it's that split of saying more central control one side, we want to do what we're told, and on the other side, we want to encourage more individual autonomy. A slightly more light-hearted view of the same thing, as I think this is a cats and dogs argument in organizations, where some organizations want everybody to just be a good dog and fetch when they're told, and other organizations are quite happy to have cats running around everywhere. So just as a catch up to sort of where I am, because I've already gone through quite a lot of ideas, the realities of leadership aren't necessarily quite what we expect on the tin, and certainly not a Hollywood ideal. Leaders aren't necessarily as impactful as we think. We can't find historically great ones. We can't agree on what the right kind of leadership is in terms of schools of thought. And there's an argument as well about how we get anything done in our organizations. The more astute of you, no doubt, will have noticed there's a gap in the corner. So I just want to talk about the next one. And Patrick, I think this is where I'm going to start talking about your question. So to do so, I've got a little picture of a GMC DeLorean here for those people that like a bit of Back to the Future. And if you don't, the example works anyway. So if you imagine that we've got this vehicle here, and we wanted to measure its torque. So effectively, that's a measure of how much power this particular vehicle can transfer to the road. As it describes here, it's a kind of a rotational force, so force times distance. So these are some actual numbers for a DeLorean, which work out to be, it doesn't matter for us, but 207 Newton meters. So we know that that's the case. If I take that same DeLorean and I test it again tomorrow and I test it again the next day, I'm still going to get that same kind of result. I've got a consistent thing in here. If, for example, I then added a flux capacitor, keeping with the Back to the Future theme, theoretically, we've got the same thing going on. I've made a change which I know about, it's made an impact, and I can see a result. So I know that the flux capacitor was the cause of that additional power, that additional torque, rather, in this vehicle. Scaling that to something more complex, if we look at the world of, say, drug development, is a pretty good place to go, I think. The way that drugs get approved globally is a very complicated and very heavily regulated set of steps. It basically starts with some kind of an idea, like we want to solve something, make a disease easier to treat or even cure it. Thousands and thousands of molecules are looked at and investigated through testing, and eventually we end up at the other end where we've got the drug approved and it's in production. Even if it gets to production, it still gets looked at. So medicines that are licensed are still under surveillance. So even a very basic drug like an aspirin or something that we take all the time, there's a chance always that we can go back through this list. It's a very rigorous process. As I said, linking to what Patrick was talking about, though, this is where things get a little bit more tricky in the social sciences space. So we don't have a flux capacitor or a molecule and a restricted trial. So let's look at some of those. Tuckman, for example, which is perhaps my I don't think I exaggerate when I say I've been taught this in every single training course I've ever been to. Someone's mentioned teams forming, norming, storming, and performing. What is never said out loud is that that was something that that conclusion, came from a study in the 1960s in a small group of people at the US Naval Medical Research Center. That didn't come from a broad range of people, and it didn't really go through any testing beyond what they had there. And yet it's been picked up as a nice idea that we can kind of talk about. What relevance that has, clearly when they were doing that, they didn't expect anybody to be talking about it on the internet, for example, as one small description. And yet it's in production, and we kind of assume that it must be correct. How about something like this, like the Agile Manifesto that many people talk about, appears on websites all over the place and is the basis of Agile methods left, right, and center, described as being the best way to do things. That's accepting the tacit knowledge and the expertise of the people in the room. That was 17 guys in a ski lodge in Utah that came up with that. That wasn't a heavily tested thing across different industries, different worlds, and especially that was a group of software engineers. So then trying to take that into other parts of an organization and say automatically it works, we've again skipped all the detail. Just to prove that I'm not having to go at people unnecessarily, though, this thing that I've just got on the screen here is, or rather was, a leadership framework that I launched a few years ago. So this was my kind of attempt at saying, this is how I think people should lead. I've since completely abandoned it. And you'll probably understand that from the way I'm talking tonight. I'm sure that there was some useful stuff in there, and there are definitely things in there that I talk to clients and colleagues about. But can I say that that definitely works? Absolutely not. I've got no evidence at all to say that it does. By the way, as a kind of general tip, and you can go back to Tuckman for this as well, if any of this stuff ever rhymes, that's a really good indication that it's probably something to avoid. So just diving a bit deeper there with this kind of challenge, and this, I think, actually, Patrick, talks directly to your point. Let's imagine that we've got a team of people who are interested in trying to make things deliver more quickly or better, whatever. And they have a go with some agile method, whatever that is. They've got a budget, and congratulations, they arrive a little bit ahead of time and below budget. So everybody, round of applause. But because they don't want to just assume that everything's okay, they do the same thing again, but use a waterfall practice this time. And they turn up even faster and even cheaper. And of course, it's confusing. Agile is supposed to be the way that we do everything, isn't it? Right? But this is never going to be a fair competition at all. Between those 2 points, the team of people involved have developed a huge amount of tacit knowledge about the customers, the technologies, each other, how they work together, and so on. What we never have with any of this social science stuff at all is the wormhole that means we can go back and try it clean with the same thing. As I'm sure you will all know, no 2 teams are the same. So even if you say you do Agile and you do Waterfall, they're different teams. The way that they handle those things are going to be different both times. Extending that up to something more organizational and talking about OKRs, and I spend quite a bit of my life, it seems, talking about OKRs. John Doerr, in his book a few years ago, made the statement that in his subtitle that OKRs are effectively how Google, Bono, and so on rock the world. So the implication that he is making, or the thing that he's actually stating, rather, it's not even an implication, is that orange line there, that Google performance is because of OKRs. The truth, of course, is we can't possibly know. Google without OKRs may have been worse, or it could have been much, much better. We've got no way of knowing for sure. We've only got one reality. And that ends up in a sort of general conclusion of all of this stuff, whether it's Maslow, Ebbinghaus, pick a name, all of it is almost certainly unproven. And even if it's got some proof, it's going to have holes in it, back to what Patrick was asking earlier, and most of it's unprovable in the first place because we just cannot know for certain. So that gets us into kind of an interesting place, really, or it certainly got me into, this is why I got to an oh my moment, I suppose, in my stuff. I'm just going to briefly, I talked about a little squiggle earlier. I was going to briefly move on to why we do these things, but just a moment to stop in case anybody's got a question burning right now.
I think you're good, Stephen. There's nothing in the chat either. So, yeah.
When I did the audio book, people were saying my voice was good for sending people off to sleep. So we might have to check that from time to time too. Right. So briefly, I'll talk about why we do this stuff. And when I say that, I don't mean to attack anyone or anything. But if we broadly say that this stuff is unproven, unprovable, we can't agree on what any of the right stuff is, yet in every organization I talk to, we've got this sort of thing. I'm often invited into a company to say, we've tried Agile, it hasn't quite worked. Can you help us make Agile better, or whatever the thing might be? It always comes from a similar place. I'll touch on a few ideas. This first the first thought really was around imagine that this is a leader in an organization, for example, and they've got an idea about the right way to lead and the right way to deliver stuff in their company. That's really positive because they've got some sensitivity to what's going on. They've got real, genuine, tacit knowledge about what's happening around them. They understand their people, their capabilities. So they're in the best place of anybody. They're certainly in a better place than McKinsey to say this is what we should be doing. Unfortunately, there are two things that maybe stand a bit in there against that. One is there is a limit to the knowledge they have, of course. So I only know what I know. So I might think that there's something better out there and people will exploit that. And then the second one, perhaps it's a little bit too much of a risk. You're very vulnerable if you put your own stuff into an organization. So maybe the results are on your shoulders. So when your boss comes along and says, we really should definitely do that thing, and you don't really know why, it's maybe just for a quiet life and getting home on time and so on, and still seeing the kids at Christmas, maybe you just tick over. The other thing that people often do, and this is perhaps the thing I meet most commonly, is I get organizations that are working with a particular consultant or provider because of their reputation. That classic idea that nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, that extends to nobody ever got fired, it seems, for engaging McKinsey, Bain, and so on into their organization. The challenge is those kind of organizations are set up slightly differently to many other organizations. They might have a few people doing some delivery who know what they're talking about, and those people are well worth it if you can find them. But they're organizations that are designed to make a lot of money and make their customers and their people a lot of money, and often are filled with a lot of finance, legal, and marketing people, perhaps, rather than deep delivery. So those sort of strange relationships and the influence and so on in this stuff makes it often very difficult to move away from the templates. Just to kind of call out a note though, because back to my kind of cape slide at the beginning with a little girl and saying they must know what they're talking about, here are just a few things that I've taught some of those big consultants in a few last year, which included things from what a SMART objective is at the bottom of that list to lean is not the same as agile. You've got some conversations to have and so on. Explaining to people that psychological safety isn't something that's just come out of California in the last few weeks. It's been around for absolutely centuries. Just ask Damocles. He knew a bit about safety. So we've got this. Anyway, you get the kind of gist. But I'm going to get to this point because there's definitely a then. So given everything that I've been talking about, where do we go? So I've got a little question for you to help answer that and move us into the next topic. Can I just ask you to take a look at that picture for me for a few seconds? Okay. And then in the chat or out loud, I don't mind, tell me what the missing letter is. Yep, lots of A's. Quite right. The thing is, when you do this kind of stuff, no one ever says you. Thank you, Corinne. I appreciate it. If you can do this the other way around, if you show people pictures of tomatoes and that sort of thing, they're more likely to pick you than they are to pick A, because of course you're just, it's a cheap parlor trick. I'm priming you with some stuff. It's a classic bit of marketing or a nudge or whatever. And that moves us into this lovely world of context. And we've touched on this quite a few times, but this is where I go a bit deeper. So context, we understand this first and foremost, this idea that it's the situation in which something happens. And I'll just talk briefly about situational context of a kind first. So we've touched a bit on this with the leadership styles from autocratic and so on earlier. If you imagine we've got this kind of spectrum from unpredictable to predictable here, there are going to be situations which are, say, a disaster. This is just some firefighters trying to put something out, for example, that are they're changing, they're hugely volatile things. So we've got situations like that will need a certain response. We've got situations which This is a picture of a crayfish to sort of illustrate that idea of invasive species. You drop an invasive species into a place, we don't know what's going to happen, and the way that we handle that and the way that we think about what might happen is different. We can then get to things that start to become more predictable. Like in this case, this is a little animation, get the word eventually, of a satellite being launched from Earth to arrive in a stable orbit around Mars, for example. And with some good mathematicians, that's quite predictable, all the way to something that truly is. So that's the fairly basic idea. And if we take that up, I suppose, to a level, we can say that when we're trying to deliver stuff in an organization, if we've got more unpredictability here on the left-hand side, so things are not going to happen as we expect, more adaptive approaches, things where we give ourselves chance to change, are going to be more useful than predictive processes when there's more predictability in our environment. Again, that's quite logical. So if we take the classic sort of delivery stuff, and I briefly touched on some of that stuff earlier, we might put Scrum somewhere, so one of the agile tools, somewhere towards the adaptive side with pure experimentation even further over. We might have something like Prince, which is quite a controlled way of delivering projects, somewhere on the predictive side with absolutely fixed procedures beyond that, let's say. This is all too simple so far, and we'll get to that in a second. But even though that's simple, if we then looked at something like this, don't worry about the detail at all, but here's just a list of some stuff that I want to get done in a project. We could take that list of things and then distribute them on that sort of predictability scale. So we can say the things on the left-hand side here are more unpredictable and the things on the right are more predictable. Put some words in, make it easy. One of the things on that list there was one of our key developers has quit. That's pretty unpredictable. We're not sure what we're going to do with that. The other side, we've got some basic procurement. That's really easy. We know what we're going to do. Even just doing that starts to say, well, there are parts of this project that we can handle in this way and other parts that we can handle better that way. What we can also do is think about the disposition of an organization. So how an organization feels, or how it kind of, regardless of what it says on the values poster, what actually is going on in the organization. So coming back to the Sloan and later Deming stuff earlier, some organizations are more Sloan, as it were, and want things controlled. Some organizations are more Deming and are more open to the idea that it's about a system and trying to be open. Put that together and we get maybe a picture like this, and we say, okay, the work we've got is fairly predictable. So on the right-hand side, our organization it likes process and procedure and control. So Prince might work up in that corner, if there is a corner of a circle. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. And I've got another little exercise for you. Can I get everybody to just do this for me, please? And imagine a lion. Nobody, nothing in chat, please, on this. Just imagine a lion. Okay, could somebody tell me what they thought of, please?
The emoji, the little lion emoji.
Sorry, Jim. Sorry, I couldn't hear you quite.
A little lion emoji.
A little lion emoji. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Jim.
Fluffy
What
mane.
else what did someone else think of?
Fluffy mane.
A fluffy mane?
The
else?
MGM lion,
Oh, the MGM lion. Yeah.
the movies. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I for a split second, I thought about doing it. That was my hesitation, Corin, and I didn't. Which
No,
is...
I thought the same thing.
Thank you. This is a quick example, right? I've only got a couple of there: a fluffy mane, an emoji, and then the MGM lion. I did this recently. Someone said in the UK, anyway, there's a chocolate bar called a lion bar, and someone mentioned that. Someone slightly more disturbingly said impending death, which I thought was a rather dark response to it. But I always find this stuff fascinating, and I do this with your family or with a team. It's brilliant. there's an interesting learning in this, if you like, of we can't agree, or rather our perception of a lion is different between all of us here. So when we say that our organization is more autonomous, or we say we're going to be customer centric, or we're going to put whatever the thing, the diversity of what's going to actually turn up in people's heads is enormous. So we might have a view that when we're standing on stage telling people that this stuff is going to happen, what's really happening is this sort of thing. So context, and this is where I sort of get to the last chapter really. Context is much more than just saying that something is unpredictable or not. I've got 15 different types of context here listed, and we've experienced a couple of them here tonight. I've given you, for example, a little bit about situation in some of the conversations about predictable and unpredictable, but I've also influenced you with things like proximity by giving you a picture of a child's dirty hands and making you do what I wanted you to do. There are different kinds of context happening all the time. And that leads us to the final part of this. And I've got a handful of slides left. Sath, am I still okay for time? Yeah?
Very much so. Yep. Yep.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, so just as a brief loop around this stuff, there's no such thing really as optimal leadership or delivery, because a lot of it depends on context, but our understanding of context, in my opinion at least, doesn't often go deep enough. We might do some stuff, but not very much. I'll introduce you to, or briefly talk then about this lady, Brenda Dervin. Is that a name that any of you are familiar with? Have you met her before? So unfortunately, she died a few years, or 3 years ago now, but there's plenty of stuff on YouTube, and she's got thousands of papers that she's written. Her kind of core was all about this idea of sense making. So in her case, she was trying to, or studying often about how to get communication to land effectively with other people, and spend a lot of time investigating how people think about information that they receive and what they do about it. This quote here, I think this is one of those, any time an organization wants to start a change, something that's just going to affect 5,000 people or whatever the thing might be, the idea of coming at that from the perspective that every single person has an absolutely unique perspective, everybody's got their own MGM lion or their fluffy emoji or whatever, I think is a really powerful place to be, but perhaps not where we go. One of Dervin's core tools is this sense-making metaphor here. And I've always loved the fact that this looks like it was drawn on an Etch-a-Sketch of some kind by she did all of the diagrams in her stuff, and it really did look like she did it with a mouse. It's brilliant. I've got my version of it just to explain what this means, because this, I think, is quite a useful tool already. So if we take an example that we've got a situation on the left-hand side, that's where the person is, that let's say in this case, it's a really simple one, we're hungry. And the outcomes where the flags are, we've just got a simple outcome of being no longer hungry on the other side. Between those 2 points, there's a gap of some kind. And in our case, that might be what to eat, how much, when, whatever, those sort of things. Now, we've got a couple of ways of getting to where we want to get to. The straight route is to use this bridge in the first place, and that relies on us. So on our own ideas, beliefs, values, that's how we expect to get across to the other side. So that might translate to, I eat chocolate when I'm hungry, so that's where I'm going, and whatever. The alternative is to look under the bridge, as it were, here to, and I'll come back to verbings in a minute, effectively ask other people or talk to others, find out what they think, find out what they sell, and so on, what's available, to create a broader picture of the situation. It might mean you go across the bridge in the way that you started, but it might mean you differ. A more complicated example, perhaps, is that we've got a CEO pressuring us to do something about AI, and we've got to do something, or at least we've got to give the CEO an answer, and we can build a similar picture. In this case, the gap might actually be none of us really understand what the CEO wants. but we can use our own initiative, or we can reach outside and talk to other people and so on. So in the bit that I want to focus on in here, because that's quite logical, I suppose, the bit I want to focus on is this bit under the bridge, these verbings, this sense-making stuff. If we're saying that there isn't an ideal way to lead and there isn't an ideal way to deliver, then how do we work out what's best for us? And that's where this stuff sits. Basically by talking to each other and getting a better perspective of your own situation. There is, however, this is fortunate and unfortunate, I suppose, no absolute way of doing that. And there are hundreds of tools. I've listed, what, 15, 20 on here, but there are hundreds of tools out there that might help you make more sense. Or Brenda talked about unsense making there, this idea of actually realizing that you had the wrong perspective, but there's lots of them. So just to give you a view, I'll very briefly talk about Cynefin and VUCA. Is Cynefin something you've met as a group? Super. Is that across the board? Brilliant. In which case I'm
not as
lovely,
not as a group. I just suspect there's many people in this call who cross paths with Cynefin as a framework. Yeah.
Super. I'll go pretty quickly, and then go from there. It is indeed. It's it basically means a habitat or a place, which makes a lot of sense if you see it on the diagram. The reason I mention that is that you may have already kind of picked up the sort of Cynefin nature of what I was talking about earlier with that unpredictable, predictable view. If I take, sorry, going back to that, if I take that list of stuff that I had earlier, and rather than do it in that horizontal way that I just did, and I use it instead on this, which has still got the same content, we've still got what is very predictable and clear, going anti-clockwise from that round to chaotic, which was the firefighters that I had in my picture. The main distinction here that we've got is in the center. There's this idea for things which are confused, things which we aren't sure where they sit, basically. And we've got that same unpredictable, predictable stuff. What that translates to, for example, if I did that same exercise here, is, oh, you have, blimey, Donald. Then, okay, I apologize. You know, I will, yeah, I'll write to him. So given that you've had that, you certainly don't need me to go into this, but I just wanted to pull on one particular thing, because that bit's easy, that bit's very basic. The main advantage, and this going back to Dervin's thing about sense making and sense unmaking, there is some value in doing that on your own. But there is a massive amount of value if you do this kind of thing in different groups. In this case, for example, very simply, group 1 decided that the world was fairly predictable and group 2 decided that it wasn't. The conversation between those two perspectives is potentially gold dust in an organization, because the implications of just going down the predictable or the unpredictable view are getting caught, obviously, when things go wrong that you didn't expect, or spending far too much money on something that was easier than we thought. So we get that sort of thing. So if you've used that and you're aware of that, how about VUCA? Have you used VUCA as a sense-making tool? You have, super. Super. So when I say used it as a sense-making tool, have you used it as a, sorry, that sounds really arrogant and pretentious. I don't mean to come at it that way. I haven't really got a useful question in there. Let me go through this same thing, the same treatment, and explain what I mean, and then I'll check again and just see if you're in the same place as me. So we tend to be familiar with this stuff, obviously, or we see this stuff all the time. What I really struggle with, though, is that, for example, the Agile Business Consortium is one example, but many others too, use VUCA as a noun. So they'll say, we live in a VUCA world, for example. That's not correct. That was never the intention of VUCA. VUCA was something that was used by I think the US Army War College originally in the 80s, and it's another situational awareness tool. So it is these 4 things. Yes. Or was that, sorry, I'm reading the chat. I should stop doing that. Nia, when I come into this next picture, we'll see for sure. So if you think about this way, in the style of the conversation we've had, something that's volatile will probably have a different treatment to something that's complex. And we know that from Cynefin already. If you liken volatile to chaos, then complex is already in a different place. So it's not all one thing. And indeed, just like Cynefin, you can have different responses depending on the kind of stuff that you're facing. So as you look at a situation, something that is complex, let's say, we know, and again from Snowden's work and Cynthia Kurtz and others, we know how to handle that. But there are different ways of handling the others. So we could do a similar kind of exercise to the one that I just described, you know, this idea of looking at the tasks I've got in my project. I've got some things in there that are complex that might need experimentation and so on. I've got some volatile things that we need to monitor and manage in a very sort of chaotic view, but I've also got some ambiguous stuff. Maybe that aligns with the confused stuff in Snowden's work, but you can use this kind of thing again as a way of providing some sense. Of course, the fascinating thing would be if you had one of these and you had someone who'd done a Cynefin map of the same thing, there's probably some really interesting insight into the conversation between those two things as well. So just a few tips that I'll just close out on with this. For all of this sense-making stuff, whether it's any of the tools that I described there, or indeed actually most of the sense-making work I do with my clients these days aren't on that list. They're things that we create effectively for the organization we're working with, because we're trying to make sense of a particular situation rather than assuming that a template will help. But some general tips. The first is, I can kind of be as bold as to say it's always better to do more sense-making exercises than it is to do one. Just getting one perspective is not going to necessarily help you go very far. And as an extension on that, doing diverse multiple exercises is better than doing lots of exercises. Diverse in terms of types of exercise, perhaps. But in this sort of case, and if you've had Dave Snowden on here, I'm sure he would have talked about this, keeping like or similar teams together to make sure that you expose the differences between perspectives, hence the colors there. The final thing I've got on this is just to talk briefly about the amount of effort, and you could probably translate that to cost. Given any situation, whether it's the project that we're trying to initiate, the transformation we're doing, or we're about to go shopping and we want to choose what to buy, we could think that we can always gain more sense by adding more effort. The reality changes every single time, and there's always judgment involved in using any of these tools. It might be that you get to a plateau. It might be that things go up and down and you end up sense unmaking before you go ahead again. So it's, unfortunately, there's no right way to definitely do this. But if you have some conversations with, let's say, a VUCA activity or a whatever, it at least moves you further forward somewhere, and then you can have a conversation about whether or not you want to do more exercises before you go and act on what it is. That's broadly the end of that. I've just got a summary then, and then we'll open up to the group more broadly. So how I've started this stuff, and this is probably the one summary slide of the whole book really, is that there's a ton of stuff out there about how we should operate, and people are always trying to sell things to us. We've talked about some of this stuff down here. There's hundreds of ways of doing it. Methods are unprovable, even if we think that they're a good idea, and context keeps changing on us anyhow. And unfortunately, between those two things, if we believe that the bottom is true, there are lots of things that are holding us to those kind of consistent tools and templates. This $400 billion leadership industry is a pretty good place to start. It's not in anyone's interest for us to stop using their tools. There's a bit of social order, human evolution, which I go much deeper into in the book as well, about how we handle these sort of situations. And then finally, doing something that isn't a template is quite hard. And it isn't, it takes some time and some vulnerability. So those things stand in the way, but I kind of sit here and I say that your better chance in an organization is to use intentional and continuous sense making between that chaos at the bottom and the chaos at the top, that you can pick things that are probably more suitable for your team, your organization right now, and then continue to do it later. So in a slightly silly way, sorry, it's one of the cartoons from the book, so I couldn't resist it, but there's no such thing as a dream framework. My suggestion is this, that frequent sense making gives you more chance of success. So I've kind of summarized all of that there, and this is being recorded. The final thing I just wanted to finish on anyway was please do reach out, please connect, please find me on LinkedIn or just email me directly. As Donald proved a little earlier, the book is out now. He's got a copy in his hand, and the audio book I've just finished recording as well. And as a bit of an announcement and a bit of a kind of thank you for coming along to listen, you can actually listen to the whole audiobook for free on my site. So there's a little sign up thing there, which effectively just gets you into a private area, but then you can listen to the book online. There are some other stuff in there, and I'm going to add more and more content over time, but that is free now and will continue to be free if you would like to listen to it. So I think that's me, Sath. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for listening and for engaging in the bits of silliness from time to time. Really appreciate it.
It was great. So I think you've left everyone with quite a lot to think about. I think there's quite a lot to digest and unpack, Stephen. So
yeah,
thank you for that.
There was quite a bit there.
Yeah, there was a ton of stuff in there, but as Donald and I were sort of chipping in the chat, it was good that you touched on things. So we have had other speakers who've come along in the past and talked about some of these topics, because they've also written books and done talks and involved in this. Dave Snowden, we know quite well. He's been here a few times. I've met him at other conferences. So yeah, his sense making work has kind of been in the in the community and various similar communities to ours for quite some time. But I think the way you summarise there around the reality of continue to try to just feel your way through things and make sense of them, because we live in this very sort of complex, volatile kind of environment. Most of our organisations fit those descriptions, and then the pace of change is such. I think that's why many of us are agile practitioners understand the importance of using empiricism, just to understand where you are and what's gone before and what you know, and try to make the best possible decisions you can to release value as quickly as you can. So yeah, all good stuff really, and lots of good things there. But I hope some of our community today will pick up your book. I'm sure they will. I look forward to tuning into your audiobook too, because I like to use, hopefully not to put me to sleep. There's lots of great things in there. So, but just to say, thanks for the great session. We do have probably about just under 10 minutes, maybe, just to pick up a few questions. As you say, it's quite a small group, so happy to open it up to the floor. You're welcome to stop sharing your screen just so we can see
by
everyone.
All means,
if that's okay. Yeah. That would be great. But yeah, happy to open it up, folks. Patrick, you've got your hand up. So you're in there. You're in there as ever. Quick as a flash. On you go.
Excuse me. Thank you, Stephen. It's really interesting. I really appreciate your perspective. So I'm like, in real time, stepping back, sense making, or trying to anyway, right? And so I may oversimplify what you are saying, but if you would just I'm checking in. Will you let me know, is this kind of what you're saying?
Sure.
How is it different from what you're really saying, and anything else? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
I haven't even started yet. That's my preface.
No. I understand the question.
Great. So you took us on a path.
You've gone very quiet, Patrick. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So you took us on a path, kind of looking at leadership over the centuries. And you showed how there was really no consensus on what leadership is that works, and everybody's got a different point of view. And then you started getting into the kind of continuums and the binaries of this side versus that side, and that's kind of one way to conceptually organize our thinking about leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think maybe it's the transition from that part to the last part that I'm trying to understand better.
Okay.
Would you say that we should more or less give up this notion of leadership in the ways that has historically been inherited, and instead move to, because they're unprovable, et cetera, you can't test for this sort of stuff reliably, instead move to a different sense-making models. That's what you're advocating for leaders to do that. Is that true? One, and then two, has there been any evidence to suggest that this sense-making approach is more effective than other approaches? So I guess the two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, and I'll try to answer that. So please do ask another if I don't quite. So the view about sense making is yes. My invitation, I suppose, is that to use sense making first, and then continue to use sense making in your work. So the way that I sort of think about things, let's take the servant leadership stuff that I talked about earlier. Let's imagine the extreme. You've got no awareness at all of the team that you're working with, no awareness of the work you've got to get done, their capabilities and so on, to walk in and say, we should organize ourselves like Spotify and everyone needs to be a servant leader tomorrow. Fundamentally, that's false. It cannot be right. I'm not, however, saying that organizing your company like Spotify or using servant leadership are inherently wrong. They could be perfect. But my experience is that people don't do that move. So an example of a sense-making exercise, this is a simple one that I did with a team. There's a group of project managers who were under pressure because the diversity of cost of their projects was too wide. So one project manager would cost £1 million to do this kind of thing, and another one would cost 10 million. And the executives didn't like that because they said, ugh. The question I got asked as I went in to help them was, will Agile make us better? And you might tell I'm not the greatest fan of agility, or at least not the way that it's used in a formulaic sense. What we did in there instead was an exercise. So before we did anything about how to organize and practice, we did some sense-making exercises together, and a string of a few, to understand more about what the work was, get better understanding about how the team understood what the work was, how they understood each other. And then we did basically the kind of thing we described there. We said, we've got some tasks that this team does that are really volatile, and we've got some that are really procedural. So instead of just saying, yay, let's do Agile, what we did was, for the stuff that was really volatile, we used lots of experimentation and data and monitoring. And for the stuff that was procedural, we nailed it hard down so that it was cheaper to do. It's a slightly difficult thing. I think I helped them dodge a bullet there, because had they just moved in and started using Scrum, they would have just been more confused. But I can't prove that based on what I've been talking about tonight anyway. Did that kind of answer your question, Patrick?
Yeah. So I guess the background would be, like, a question is asked, an organization's trying to figure something out, and and I agree with what you're saying, is like, don't impose a pre-existing framework onto that organization, especially when you don't know anything about what they're doing or what their challenges are, or maybe even they don't know what their challenges are. And that's where the sense-making framework or sense-making approach comes in. Is that close?
But it gives you, if you take a little time to understand where you are, it's never going to be perfect, but you're better placed to know, back to the question you asked right at the start of the presentation, you're better placed to know whether or not the thing you've done might have had an impact. It still could be correlation, not causation, but you've at least got, you knew where the world was before you started, before you kind of broke everything by telling everybody that they don't have a manager anymore, before working out anything else.
Right. It was seen that at least once the sense making takes place, people have some level of confidence in selecting some path forward, and that gets created organically out of the sense making process.
Yeah. And the thing with the sense making stuff, we do it completely naturally. This might just be a conversation you have. I can almost guarantee you've had one this week where you spoke to someone and said, oh, I didn't realize that, or I didn't understand you thought that. All I'm encouraging is to try and embrace that a bit more, and especially before people do something quite structural.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for that, Stephen, and thank you as ever, Patrick, for your participation and questions, which we love. We're kind of coming up on time, so I think we probably have just about enough time for one last quick question, if there is any burning questions. Otherwise, I'll start to wrap up. Okay, I think we're good. I think that's you off the hook, Stephen. But no, it was a great session. I really enjoyed it. As I said, lots to think about, lots to unpack. So I'm sure others will enjoy the recording when we get it on our YouTube channel. So just to say thanks again for a fabulous session. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for the invite.
I hope others will. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm sure others will pick up your book and your audio book too, which you've kindly offered. So yeah, thanks again for giving your time. And thanks to everyone else for joining.
Do let me know what you think if you do listen to the book or you read it.
Please.
And I'd love to have your thoughts.
Great, absolutely. Yeah. So there's your open invitation to give Stephen some feedback back when you get the chance to digest his book. And well,
yeah, exactly. You might get out of this and think I'm mad. So
any format you want. But no, thanks to you all for joining. Really enjoyed it. Another great session. And just to remind you all, we do have a session in for March. That's on the very hot topic of AI. I think what we like about this particular talk is it's really not one of those typical talks around robots are taking over the world and all this stuff. It's a great talk. It's a talk I've heard before from Stuart Munton, who's a friend of mine, and he will be talking about the convergence. So it's really about how AI can really be advantageous in how we move forward as agile teams and the role it can play in augmenting what you're trying to do. It's a very insightful talk. So if that sounds interesting to you, do join. Corin, you might have joined that because you were in Agile Ireland. It's where we met. So it's Stuart's talk from there. I don't know if you sat in on that one.
Part of it.
Yeah, it's a great talk.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's really good.
Yeah, he's doing that.
About it.
Yeah, he's doing that here next month. And Donald and I are working on a few other great sessions for you too. So we should have a few more published over the coming weeks, which should take us up to well into the summer. So look out for those. Is there any shout outs anybody wants to make for a close off the event? No, somebody wants to share? No. Okay, all good. Well, thanks again for joining. It's great to see you all, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in your own day. And thanks again to our amazing speaker, Stephen Morris, for joining us. So thank you all. Take care, and hope to see you again soon. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
Lovely to meet
See you
you.
later.
Thanks, folks.